First things first, a word of appreciation for the opportunity to stand before you this evening at the Fuchsberg Center for Conservative Judaism in Jerusalem. A moment of appreciation for the challenge posed to me yesterday by my sister Helen Miller, attending this evening tonight from Columbus, Ohio, who asked how it is that an Orthodox Jew would be speaking at a conservative center. Well, my younger son, who headed off for a stint in the Israeli army this morning, as on Army Reserves, shares a bunk with every conceivable kind of Jew who lives in Israel, whether they eat badatz or whether they eat treif. In other words, in Israel we all stand together, and despite our differences we stand as one. The other example of unity of purpose expresses itself in all forms of Judaism in Israel. Stand firmly against any interfaith marriage, the kind of which we saw most recently at the widely publicized interfaith wedding ceremony of the daughter of the U.S. Secretary of State. We stand together in Israel in all forms of Judaism, and that's a great sense of unity and purpose. Indeed, celebrating 60 years on earth and 40 years in Israel provides an appropriate venue for recollection, for reflection. Before I forget, if anyone does have a cell phone, please throw it out the window or close the phone.
Thank you.
There is the well-known tradition that you are reborn when you arrive in Israel, when you choose the inheritance, the Yerusha, of the land that God has given to every Jew. This 60-40 birthday represents an opportune time to recall anecdotes over the last 40 years, which reflects the contrast between what we perceive as reality and the reality that unfolds in everyday life in Israel, to the point where a North American Oleg often feels that he could not have grasped the complexities of Israeli life without intense preparation from a childhood dominated by The Twilight Zone, Mad Magazine, Candid Camera, Get Smart, Bizarro Comics, which prepare you for the topsy-turvy life in Israel. Look back at 40 years. A nation of 2.6 million, which has tripled in size. A $2.5 billion GNP that now surpasses $300 billion GNP. Buses which took an hour and a half to Tel Aviv now take 50 minutes to get there. Buses that took 3.5 hours to go to Haifa, hour and 50 minutes. 250,000 cars on the road when we came here. Now 3 million private vehicles on the road. In 1970, 3 years after the Six-Day War, there was a post-miracle atmosphere that elevated Jerusalem in that period of time. Departing from the text, think of 1970, think of the numbers. You meet someone who is 65 years old on the street. He had his bar mitzvah in 1918 at the end of World War I. He experienced Harpat, 1929. He was here, perhaps, in everything that went on here during World War II. He'd experienced all the wars. He was only 65. The people who were 45, to meet them in the way many of us learned Hebrew on the buses, was to just get on the bus and start asking questions. Asking simple questions like, what happened in 1948? And all of a sudden, the 48 war was fought on the bus between the people there, between everyone who had their own version of what happened. That was one way to learn Hebrew. Most people whom you would recall, who would meet at the time, would recall the 3-week wait before the war, before the Six-Day War, and the shared fright that was like to live, to get through another trauma, wondering what the Jewish people would face yet another Holocaust, this time in Israel. To have arrived in Israel in 1970 was to experience a nation which experienced some kind of post-miracle traumatic stress syndrome. Walking here this evening through Jerusalem's Independence Park, I'm reminded of the first Hebrew pun that ever came to mind, heard during that momentous first week in Israel, about a park transformed from Gan Atzamot to Gan Atzmaut, from what was supposed to be a garden of bones to a garden of independence. That was because independence was dug up in May 1967 to facilitate the expected burial of 20,000 Jerusalem civilians when the war would break out. 20 Jerusalem civilians were killed, not 20,000 during the June '67 war. From a more intellectual perspective, it is hard not to recall the remarks of Hebrew University education professor Mike Rosenak, whose opening remarks to the students at Hebrew University that year, 40 years ago, were that people outside of Israel too often create ideological idealizations that are based on someone else's reality. Supporters of Israel paint Israel as a perfect place, while Israel's detractors paint Israel as a place where indiscretions can't ever be corrected. Thinking of Mike Rosenak's words, the dissonance between the assumptions and the realities in Israel remain the challenge of Israel Resource News Agency and the theme of the Research Center for Near East Policy Research, the two agencies that we run over here at Bedein. Now for some anecdotes that reflect that dissonance. June 1967, the first week of June 1967, mulling around with other high school students at the Israeli consulate in Philadelphia, volunteering for Israel during those turbulent weeks at the time of the siege of the Straits of Tiran and the virtual strangulation of Eilat imposed by Egypt, then the titular head of the Arab League. I asked the Israeli consul in Philadelphia, what about the guarantees that the United States provided in 1957 to Israel? We learned about it in high school. Everyone talked about that. This was the incentive for Israel to withdraw its forces from Sinai after the '56 war. They never existed, were the words of the Israeli consul. In other words, these American guarantees, that it would come to Israel's rescue in case of an Egyptian blockade, meant nothing. Indeed, the week before the Six-Day War broke out, we now know that Israel Foreign Minister Abba Eban came to Washington and asked about those guarantees, only to discover, even after visiting the presidential archives of former President Eisenhower in Gettysburg, that the U.S. guarantees never existed. So much for an illusion that had become a common assumption held by Israeli and American Jews as we grew up in the months, weeks, and days that preceded the Six-Day War. From the flushed look on the face of the Philadelphia consul, we understood that Israel was now on its own. February 1970, Israeli left-wing pundit Amos Kenan arrives at my campus at the University of Wisconsin to defend Israel in front of a festering new left. He read out his seminal message, a letter to all good people, in which he spelled out his recognition of Palestinian Arab nationhood, which was something revolutionary at the time, and held out one request: please recognize our dignity and our nationhood as Jews, and please recognize that the Arab League had every intention to obliterate the Jewish state in 1967 in no uncertain terms. Then Kenan added a personal story, which electrified a generation of young Americans who, as a matter of conscience, wanted to resist the orders of the U.S. to engage in what they construed to be war crimes in Vietnam. Kenan told the students in Madison that in Israel you are honored if you stand up for your beliefs, even against our own army. It was then that Kenan related his own story about how he refused orders to expel Arab residents from a village in the aftermath of the 1967 war, with the directive to burn the village after doing so. Kenan described how he had led a national campaign to disobey that order, asking for support for his belief that this was indeed a war crime. Kenan said that in Israel, no one can ever say that he was only following orders. That Kenan speech, published in Midstream magazine at the time, inspired a generation of Olim that Israel honored those who acted upon their beliefs. 30 years later, I interviewed another man of conscience, who recently passed away, Doug Eshkoli, the regional mayor of the Upper Galilee in the 60s, who had the courage during the Six-Day War to appear at the Security Cabinet of Israel to stake his entire career on his argument with the legendary Moshe Dayan on the last day of the Six-Day War, because Dayan did not want to conquer the Golan to remove the Syrian threat to the Upper Galilee. Eshkoli described his act of disobedience, which earned him a place of honor in the history of Israel, when he threw down the keys to the gates of the Galilee residence on the table in front of all government ministers and threatened to abandon the Galil if the government did not take the Golan. After that moment of courage, Levi Eshkol announced that his heart was with Eshkoli and not with Moshe Dayan. Only then did Eshkol give the orders to take the Golan. May 1972 marked the culmination of an Israeli-Arab interaction group that Rabbi Jack Cohen, my first supervisor in Israel, had launched at Beit Hillel, which was over here on Rehov Balfour, not far from us. A group of Jewish, Muslim, and Christian students were interviewed on Israel Radio at the end of the 2-year project. The interview was then called Gal HaKal. The interviewer asked each of us what it was like to share of ourselves with the other and asked about whether we had gained a greater understanding of one another. In the words of Jack Cohen, what was important was not only that what we said to each other in dialogue, but what we said to one another after the dialogue about the people that we just spoke with. In the middle of the interview, held on that night of May 31st, 1972, news of the Lod massacre broke. The tears that flowed from the Arab participants were loud, clear, and filled with emotion and grief when they heard the news that Arab terrorists had hired Japanese terrorists to mow down tourists at the baggage claim. 3 years later, walking with a group of students, making Shabbat preparations to go back to Kiryat Moriah for their first Shabbat in Jerusalem, a refrigerator bomb blew up in Kikar Tzion in the heart of Yerushalayim, a few feet from some of the students. One of the students went into shock from the sight of seeing people being blown to bits in front of him. Over the next few days, the ringleaders behind the blast were arrested as accomplices in planting the bomb. 2 of the people arrested were the young men who led our dialogue group from the Arab side. They had been acting as sleepers for PLO terror cells in Jerusalem. The same guys who had cried buckets of tears for the victims of terror had themselves been terrorists. A surprise. May 1973, 4 friends who were single soldiers at the front returned to Jerusalem for the IDF military parade, for those of you who were here, in May 1973, in full-grade Aleph battle regalia. They all reported, however, that there was a sudden preparation at the front, and that Syrians and Egyptians were poised to attack. They couldn't tell that to anyone, because the attitude in Israel at the time, you will remember, was that Arabs are not capable of attacking Israel, until the attack finally occurred on Yom Kippur. These single soldiers from 4 different places in the world were not surprised. Their commanders were surprised. Thinking of anecdotes about the Yom Kippur War, Aryeh Twaig, our Tanakh teacher, our Bible teacher at part1, comes to mind. He did not want to serve in the Army Reserves in the spring at the expense of his students. He was teaching in 3 places. He wanted to be loyal to his students, and wound up serving during Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur at a cost to his family. The cost was even greater because Aryeh was killed on the first day of the Yom Kippur War as a reservist at the Suez Canal. Then there was Dr. Moshe Rimon, lived over here on Sokolov Street, who had been treating me for gastroenteritis in my first nervous years in Israel. He treasured every moment he could to learn Torah with his son. In between doctor appointments, he had been in the Army for a year, when his son came home on furloughs from his first year in the Army. His son was killed on the first day of the Yom Kippur War, when the Syrians climbed the fence of his kibbutz and slaughtered his Nachal unit, which included many young girl soldiers. Visiting Dr. Rimon, the gastro problem seemed to fade away when you consider the pain that he would live with for the rest of his life. And then there was Yossi Yonai, who trotted the globe to learn how to apply the urban kibbutz idea to Israel, so that people in Israel's urban areas would learn how to greater ties and bonds between them. Yossi, an officer in the paratroopers, was killed taking the Golan, and the idea of the urban kibbutz was put on ice. A year after the Yom Kippur War, Israel witnessed a series of brutal PLO attacks. One of these was the Ma'alot massacre, where high school students were held hostage by the PLO, with carnage taking place at the end of the day, leaving 22 dead and 72 injured. Our social work class volunteered to go to the spot to help the students in their pain who had survived. One girl sobbed to us that the doctor said to her that she would survive, not to worry, but she just wouldn't be able to have children. It was hard to console the young girl. Well, 10 years later, as a social worker in the spot, the same girl walked by with a baby carriage. I said, Gewalt, what happened? She said, well, I gave birth to my first child, a girl, and she was born with the shrapnel.